I'm Neha Sami. I'm one of the faculty here at IIHS, and in the UFP, both across the commons and the electives, I teach on questions of urban and regional governance. And I'm going to share a little bit of what you'll see in our teaching through the MasterClass today. Here we go. And so before we get really into specifics about sort of governance and governing processes in our cities, I want to take us back a couple of years to the pandemic. And most of us lived through it. It wasn't exactly the most pleasant time. But I think it raised a lot of interesting and important questions about how cities function, the kind of roles our cities play. And these were all, I think, brought to a crisis and a head because we were facing such a difficult situation. The pandemic was an unprecedented disaster, and we had no idea how to handle these things. And there were a lot of questions raised about how city governments could be better empowered to tackle crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. What if our mayors had much more power, whether it was time for a new urban model. There were conversations about whether the mayors should be much more like CEOs of companies with sort of thinner government and more direct action empowering them, whether the government in India had failed in the pandemic and the role that civil society had played in sort of providing support to communities, to the state in various ways. And most fundamentally, a question about what then should we do about the way our cities are planned, are built, and are governed. And I think that the thing I want to focus on here is that there are a few different kind of aspects around this question of governance that emerged particularly sharply over the time that we spent over the 2 years of the pandemic. And the first was, these questions that were raised around whether the local government represented by the mayor had enough power to tackle questions like that of a pandemic. You can apply that to questions of flooding, to disasters, or to just everyday functioning of a city. The second is the question of sort of how city governments could have the capacity and be empowered better in terms of finances, in terms of actually just knowledge and technical support in being able to deal with these kinds of things. And the third, the multiplicity of actors that came up and sort of emerged to enable our cities to be able to function despite the crisis that we were in. And so civil society, resident welfare associations, a whole range of sort of academic and non-academic actors, private sector players, including sort of, those who helped make the vaccine, and sort of all the way up and down the scale, were sort of involved in enabling us to get back on our feet in multiple ways. And sort of that brings us back to thinking about how do we reimagine the role of cities and the way our cities are planned and governed right now. And I think that's really at the core of this question of urban governance. So who actually governs? And we saw through the pandemic that it wasn't just the state, where the state stepped in, when the state stepped in to sort of provide and facilitate certain actions. They were also supported by civil society. They were supported by a whole range of private sector actors. The city mayors, where they could and were able to do things, were able to do things, a lot more quickly, were much more nimble on their feet. And also that, the sort of possibility of being able to tap into experts, to be able to tap into a whole range of knowledge systems enabled, us to deal with second and third waves a little bit better than the first. And I think that what I want to focus on here is not whether the government failed in the pandemic, but the fact that we need multiple layers of actors and stakeholders to be able to make urban regions and systems work. They need to function across multiple scales. They need to function across multiple sectors. And they need to tap into a whole range of systems and processes. So, what really is governance and why does it matter? Governance is different from government. I think that's the first thing to remember. The government is perhaps the largest actor. It is perhaps the single most important actor in the governing process, but it is not the only actor. We have sort of private sector players all the way from consultants and real estate developers to civil society actors to community activists, all of whom are part of the urban governance process. The other thing to remember is that it is continuous. The governance process doesn't stop with one election. It doesn't stop with the resolution of one problem. We continue to, as we live in cities, we continue to govern. The way we use our spaces, we continue to govern. The way in which we use and access information, we govern. So we as residents, but we also as urban practitioners, are constant participants in this continuous process of governing. Like I said, from the COVID example, we govern across multiple scales. So when we look again at COVID, there was support coming from the national, state, and from the local governments. And without sort of coordination and support across all of these, responses failed. And we've already talked about the question of multiple stakeholders. And so the way that I like to think about governance, of course, in addition to being a process, is that it is an amalgamation and the sum of many, many different ways in which individuals and institutions, public and private, plan and manage the common affairs of the city. It is a continuous process, and it is continuous also because there are a whole set of conflicting and diverse interests that need to be accommodated. And as you can imagine, the diversity of Indian cities sort of brings that to light very much. And again, sort of crisis events like the pandemic bring that very much to light, but it is not something that comes to light only during a crisis event. We live that reality every day. And so a continuous process that requires sort of bringing together conflicting and diverse interests through collaboration, through cooperative action, which then goes back to this question of there needing to be multiple voices and multiple stakeholders at the table. It includes formal arrangements, so it includes, say, the urban planning process, voting at local elections, as well as informal arrangements, through the way a lot of us kind of deal with our individual local legislatures, building on social capital, exactly in the way sort of, a lot of us dealt through crisis situations in the pandemic where we called in on social capital across our own networks to be able to provide support. When we talk about specifically then what is urban in the Indian context, where does this governing process take place, and how does that work in the context of our cities? The thing to remember, and I think the thing that I would like to emphasize, is that the idea of what is urban, if I were to ask you to think and imagine of what is a city, you could tell me sort of what it is, but there isn't really sort of a very clear sense of where the city starts and where something else that is not the city begins. And so the idea of thinking of what the urban is, particularly in the Indian context, has always been a bit of a sort of fugitive imagination, particularly in the minds of policymakers. And it hasn't been until the 1990s, until economic liberalization, that we actually started to think a little bit more about what urban governance actually means. And when we think about the scale of the challenge ahead of us, I just want to show you a little bit of data on the scale of the challenge that we're facing. So these are, remember, census data from 2011, based on an IIHS analysis that we did over here. So according to census data, which defines the urban as on the basis of three criteria: population, density, and labor, 32% of our population in 2011 was already urban. However, if we used population data alone, over half the country was urban in 2011. If we used density alone, which is more than 5,000 people, 400 people per square kilometer, 70% was urban in 2011. However, the challenge here is that of the 32% that is officially urban, only 26% is officially governed as urban. And so we are already under-governing. And if we look at the data that we have, even if we take sort of just by the labor statistic or just by population, we're about 50% urban. And this is, remember, over 10 years ago. And so we're desperately under-governed. And we're desperately sort of lacking the capacity that we need to govern our urban-like settlements simply because they're not counted. We are desperately understaffed as far as planners go. And so the challenge that we face as far as urban governance goes is immense. And we definitely need much more kind of capacity building. We need a lot more support within state institutions, but we also need to think a little bit about why it matters that we think about what urban governance is. And so why does it matter how we define the urban, and what implications does that have for questions of urban governance? So if we look at where we stand, for example, in relation to other countries, for example, China would have, if we took our definition, India would have been 70% urban in 2011 if we went by China's definition of what is urban. If we went according to the Japanese, we would have been 40% urban in 2001. And so this is just to indicate partly the challenge that we face, the question of how deep the crisis is in some ways. And this is, again, remember, we're looking only at existing urban settlements. We're not looking at emerging urban settlements. The recent kind of national infrastructure pipeline has announced a series of 11 to 14 new infrastructure corridors that are being built, with 20 to 30 new settlements along each of those. This does not cover any of that. So the sort of under-governance problem only continues to increase. We're desperately understaffed. Over 60% of our planning positions in urban government are not filled. And so, the capacity problem is deeply acute. And the implications of this are particularly telling because the way funding schemes, for example, in India are accessed are based on your classification. So there's Swachh Bharat Urban and there's Swachh Bharat Rural. There is, Narega, which is sort of, employment guarantee schemes for rural India. But with the exception of a couple of states, that does not exist across the urban side of the country. And so your access to funding support, your access to social protection, your access to schemes depends fundamentally on whether you're urban or you're rural. Your governing structure, how close you are to your government, whether you're with a panchayat system or are you with a municipality, that determines how much access you have to your leaders. It determines the level of representation you have in government. And when a village goes from being a large village to a small town, the panchayat structure changes quite drastically into something that's a little bit more distant and tends to have a little bit more distance from those that are being governed. And finally, it matters deeply in questions of assessing basic service needs and infrastructure questions. There are questions around sort of providing basic infrastructure. There are questions around providing social protection, around questions of health and access to education, all of which is determined by whether you are governed as urban or rural. There are a whole set of challenges that emerge also in terms of sort of capacity changes. So it's challenging to sort of transition from a straight-up kind of rural government structure in the panchayat system into an urban governance structure, and we have no systems in place or processes in place to build that capacity as we move. And so who then does govern? Like I said, there are a wide range of actors across state and non-state, across domestic and international locations, and across various scales. And have we tried to fix this before? Yes, we have. The 74th constitutional amendment that was passed in the mid-1990s actually devolved government to the third tier, which was the urban local body. However, the implementation of that stayed with and at the discretion of the state government. And so what you see more than 25 years on from the implementation of the CAA is that the sort of application of the 74th Amendment has been very piecemeal. It's been fragmented and scattered, and in no state across the country has it been fully administered. And so to go back to that question at the start about, would in Indian cities and their mayors be able to do more if they were empowered more? Yes, absolutely. But at this point, we don't have that kind of capacity. We don't have directly elected mayors, for example. City governments don't have control over decision-making abilities. When plans are made, they go to the state government for approval. And most often, planning approvals come from parastatals, which are regional development authorities and are sort of governed by and are responsible to the state government and not to city residents or to locally elected officials. And so the challenge that we face is that despite having, the sort of legal framework within which urban governance is empowered and should function, we have failed to actually implement it across the country. And so a lot of the challenges that we face are not really challenges of maybe devising new forms of governance, but of actually implementing what we already have on the ground. The other thing that the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act did was that it, and this has kind of also fundamentally changed the way in which our cities are planned and governed and built, is that it opened the door to non-state actors in the process of governing our cities. And so as the third tier of government opened up, one of the requirements was to have public participation across the board through ward committees and a whole range of other participatory mechanisms at the city scale. But it also opened up avenues for non-state actors to demand ways to participate. It in some ways opened the door to enabling sort of a range of private actors, especially consultants, in the process of planning our cities. But it also opened space for a whole set of community actors to come and demand space in the process of governing our cities. What we've seen over time has been the creation of these new spaces for a whole set of non-state actors. Others have spoken about how this has sometimes amounted to elite capture, where there has been sort of a new emerging middle class that has captured the urban governance process. There has been sort of discussion about how and whether we need a completely new paradigm of governing our cities. There are questions about what this means and what this kind of sort of lack of urban representation means in terms of how our cities are governed, how we have access to funding, and more recently also debates around sort of where the economy is growing the most, where income is generated and where it ends up getting distributed. And urban settlements tend to get a disproportionately lower sort of share of funding as compared to the amount of income and sort of resources that they generate. And so there are a whole set of sort of larger questions and challenges around questions of how we govern our cities, who governs them. And this is, again, talking just about what we have already, the fact that we are desperately undergoverned, that we're close to 50% urban or urban-like, and we're struggling to manage the urban challenges that we face over there. And this is only going to be kind of compounded as we face newer emerging settlements, as we face new kind of infrastructure projects that disrupt existing ecosystems, as we face a changing climate. And I think that the sort of urban governance challenge is sort of perhaps the biggest one facing us as we go into, the multiple sort of polycrises that we deal with. And so what do we do kind of going forward? There are a whole range of ways in which we can go ahead. There are a whole set of options of thinking about sort of the way we decentralize power more, how we think about sustainably transitioning our cities, how we build kind of transitionary steps and mechanisms to enable, small rural to big rural to small urban, and so on. But it's going to be an uphill task. It's not straightforward. but it's exciting, and we'll talk about that and a lot more at the UFB. So come join us.